April 25th, 1946. A quiet afternoon in Naperville, Illinois. Two trains full of passengers, hopes, and everyday routines were about to cross paths in the worst way possible. One had stopped unexpectedly. The other was racing at nearly 80 miles per hour, unaware of the disaster just seconds ahead. In just a blink, metal twisted, cars crumpled, and lives were changed forever. 45 people lost their lives. More than 100 were injured. What caused this deadly crash? Was it a mistake or something more? This is the true story of the Naperville train disaster, the tragedy that changed American train safety forever. Naperville is a city in the state of Illinois, in the United States. It's located about 27 miles or 43 kilometers west of Chicago and is now considered one of its suburbs. As of 2020, over 149,000 people live here. The city also lies around 60 miles or 96 kilometers southeast of Rockford. Naperville sits along the Chicago subdivision, a busy rail line running from Chicago in the east to Aurora in the west. Today, this route has 3 to 4 tracks and is not electrified. Back in the 1940s, it was owned and operated by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, also known as the CB&Q. The rail line through Naperville has 3 tracks and is often called the racetrack. That's because freight and local trains use the outer tracks, while fast express trains run on the center track. This middle track is designed for trains to move in both directions at high speeds. The first train involved in the crash was called the Exposition Flyer, often simply known as the Advance Flyer. It was an express passenger train running from Chicago's Union Station all the way to Oakland, California. On the day of the accident, the train was made up of 13 cars. The first 8 were head-end cars, used for carrying mail, baggage, and a mobile post office. Behind them were 5 passenger coaches, carrying people on their long journey west. At the front of the train were 2 powerful diesel locomotives, both from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. These were EMD E7 units, built in 1945, specifically for fast, heavy passenger trains. Each locomotive had 6 axles, and the main version, known as the E7A, came with a driver's cab. There was also a special version called the E7B, which had no cab of its own. It couldn't run alone but was designed to be controlled by an E7A unit in front of it. This was a space-saving way to run multiple locomotives as one powerful unit, which was common on American railroads at the time. The second train involved in the crash was the Exposition Flyer, another fast passenger service running the same route from Chicago to Oakland. Operated by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, it had been in service since 1939. On the day of the accident, the Exposition Flyer was made up of 9 passenger cars, each with 4 axles. Unlike the Advance Flyer, it was not carrying any mail or baggage cars, making it much shorter than usual, just over half its normal length. At the front of the train was a pair of powerful diesel locomotives, CBQE 59910A, followed by 9910B. This setup was similar to the one pulling the Advance Flyer. The train was under the control of engineer Mr. Blaine. The locomotives were EMD E5s, built in 1940 specifically for high-speed passenger service. Like the E7s, they had 6 axles and were powered by the same type of supercharged V12 diesel engines, but they were geared for higher speeds. Together, the Advance Flyer and the Exposition Flyer were carrying about 225 passengers, along with their crews, when tragedy struck. On April 25, 1946, the Advance Flyer left Chicago's Union Station at 12:35 p.m., beginning its long journey toward California on the west coast of the United States. Just 2 minutes later, the Exposition Flyer departed the same station, heading for the same destination, racing along the same tracks. Around 20 minutes after leaving Chicago, the Advance Flyer roared through Naperville at high speed. But just as it passed through, something unusual happened. In the last car, the rear brakeman, Mr. Grant, thought he saw an unknown object fly out from under the train. He couldn't be sure what it was, but he didn't want to take any chances. He quickly signaled the front crew to stop the train as soon as possible. At 1 p.m., the advance flyer came to a halt in downtown Naperville. Its rear coach stopped right over the Loomis Street level crossing. Because this was an unscheduled stop, safety rules required one crew member, called the flagman, to walk back along the tracks to warn any oncoming trains in case they hadn't yet seen the signals. While most of the crew began checking the train's wheels and suspension, one man grabbed a warning flag and started walking eastbound, back along the line, toward the direction of Chicago. The flagman had barely begun walking when, at 1:01 p.m., the Exposition flyer came into view. Rounding a wide, sweeping curve that trains normally take at full speed. The crew had already started braking, but it was too late. The train was still moving far too fast. There was no time to shout a warning, no chance to clear the tracks. Just 1 minute later, at 1:02 p.m., disaster struck. The Exposition flyer, still traveling at 45 miles or 72 kilometers per hour, slammed straight into the back of the stationary advance flyer. The first thing it hit was a heavy 68-seat observation car, the very last car on the train. The impact was brutal. The lead locomotive, CBQ 9910A, had its front wheel assembly ripped off as it struck the rear car. But the massive engine didn't stop. It kept pushing forward, its frame acting like a steel wedge, plowing into the passenger car. It sliced the observation car in half, lengthwise, crushing seats, walls, and passengers inside. The locomotive tore through 3/4 of the car before finally getting stuck, its speed and weight leaving behind a trail of destruction and chaos. The force of the crash didn't stop with the first car. The entire rear observation car was shoved forward, violently slamming into the next coach. That car, nearly identical, was also pushed ahead with massive force. But the third car in line, Car 12, was a lightweight dining car. It didn't stand a chance. Caught between two heavy cars behind it and several stationary ones ahead, Car 12 was crushed into a U-shape. It bent and buckled under the pressure, trapped between an unstoppable force and an immovable wall. The cars farther up the train, though still largely intact, derailed and tipped over, their wheels lifted from the rails as the shockwave of metal and momentum continued forward. In just seconds, the quiet town of Naperville was turned into a scene of horror. 45 people lost their lives in the crash. 44 of them were passengers on the advance flyer, many of them seated near the back, where the force of the impact was strongest. The 45th victim was Mr. Creighton, the fireman of the Exposition flyer, the driver's assistant. He had jumped from the cab just before the crash in a desperate attempt to survive, but did not make it. Another 125 people were injured, some critically. Many were pulled from twisted wreckage by local residents who rushed to help, long before rescue crews could even arrive. The collision happened just steps away from the Croyler Manufacturing Company, a large furniture factory in Naperville. Within moments, over 800 workers from the factory dropped everything and rushed toward the wreckage. They were the first to respond, long before emergency crews could arrive. With no time to wait, they rendered first aid, comforted the injured, and quickly turned part of the factory floor into a makeshift triage center. They used their own furniture, chairs, bed frames, and cushions to keep the wounded off the cold concrete. Anything soft enough to act as a hospital bed became one. From a nearby college, students brought mattresses and helped build makeshift stretchers using scrap wood from a local construction site. They worked side by side with factory workers, doing whatever they could to save lives. The scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Naperville had no ambulances, not a single one, so survivors were loaded into hearses, pickup trucks, and station wagons. Some were taken to hospitals lying flat in the back of random vehicles, whatever could carry a body, without making the injuries worse. Despite the violence of the crash, most of the train cars remained fairly intact. But at the very center of the wreckage, one image stood out, haunting and unforgettable. The rear car of the advance flyer had been ripped open, its sides peeled away like a tin can. And jammed deep inside it was the shiny silver locomotive of the Exposition flyer, still embedded most of the way through, frozen in place by the force of its own destruction. It was in this wreckage that rescue efforts gave way to recovery. The bodies of the dead were carefully brought to a nearby lumber yard. There, in a quiet room known as the chef's office, they were gently laid out in rows. Volunteers worked into the night, matching body parts to bodies, trying to give names back to the lifeless and bring some peace to the families waiting for news. Some of the victims were young soldiers, men who had survived World War II, only to lose their lives here, in a peaceful town, on a quiet train ride home. The story of Mr. Creighton, the fireman aboard the Exposition flyer, carries a weight all its own. He had jumped from the locomotive just moments before the crash, and tragically, he didn't survive the fall. At first, his death might seem especially cruel, especially since the locomotive itself suffered only minor damage in the collision. But Mr. Creighton's choice wasn't made in panic. It was shaped by memory. 3 years earlier, his own brother had died in another train crash, one where the locomotive burst into flames after impact. That memory, still fresh in his mind, likely influenced his decision to jump. Later, when rescuers examined the wrecked cab, they made a chilling discovery. A piece of debris had smashed through the cab window, piercing exactly where Mr. Creighton would have been standing. In the end, his fate may have been sealed either way. The Naperville crash led to 4 separate investigations, each carried out independently. The inquiries came from the county coroner's office, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, local law enforcement, and most importantly, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the government agency that later evolved into today's National Transportation Safety Board. All 4 investigations came to the same conclusion. The brakes on both trains were working perfectly, and the signaling system between Chicago and Naperville had been functioning exactly as it should. One signal in particular, Signal 227.1, located about 1.25 miles or 2 kilometers from the crash site, became a central focus. When the advance flyer slowed and came to a stop beyond it, the signal correctly changed from green to yellow, warning the oncoming Exposition flyer that the track ahead was not clear. Once Mr. Blaine, the engineer of the Exposition flyer, was able to give his statement, he confirmed what many had feared. He said he saw the yellow signal and applied the brakes immediately, but the train had been going too fast, and there simply wasn't enough distance left to stop. To test Mr. Blaine's statement, investigators assembled a train identical to the Exposition flyer involved in the crash. They ran a controlled test, starting at 81 miles or 130 kilometers per hour. When the brakes were applied at the same location where Blaine claimed to have reacted, Signal 227.1, the train came to a complete stop 395 feet or 120 meters before the next signal, known as 228.1. That meant the train would have stopped over 1,300 feet or 405 meters before the site of the actual crash. Investigators then considered another possibility, that Mr. Blaine may have missed Signal 227.1 and only noticed the next one, Signal 228.1, which would have been much closer to the stopped advance flyer. They tested this theory too, this time applying the brakes at 86 miles or 138 kilometers per hour, just as the train passed Signal 228. 1. The result? The test train stopped 393 feet or 120 meters beyond the point of impact, a distance that closely matched the real crash. When interviewed, Mr. Blaine, the engineer of the Exposition flyer, admitted he may have been going slightly over the local speed limit of 80 miles or 130 kilometers per hour. But he firmly insisted that the moment he saw Signal 227.1, he triggered a full emergency stop. He was also sure that he had not missed or confused any signals. Some outside witnesses supported his version of events. A few people claimed they saw sparks coming from the train's wheels, a possible sign that the brakes had been slammed hard. But at the crash site, investigators found no solid evidence to support that claim. Even more troubling, some members of the train crew disagreed with their driver. They believed the train had been using service braking, a slower, more controlled form of braking that doesn't trigger the emergency system. Service braking is designed to reduce speed gradually, offering more comfort for passengers, but it comes with a cost, a much longer stopping distance. Investigators also raised questions about the actions of the advance flyer's conductor and flagman. Why had the train stopped just beyond a high-speed curve, where visibility was limited? And had the flagman reacted quickly enough to warn the oncoming train? The conductor defended his decision, saying he had no way of knowing what might be wrong with the train. When something appears to fly out from beneath an express train at high speed, stopping immediately is the only safe choice. He argued that it would have been far more dangerous to continue moving, especially if the train had lost a piece of its suspension or undercarriage. That kind of failure could easily lead to a derailment. As for the flagman, investigators eventually cleared him of any wrongdoing. There was no proof that he could have moved faster or changed the outcome, given the short amount of time he had. In the end, one final mystery remained. What had Mr. Grant actually seen? To this day, no one knows for certain what flew out from under the advance flyer that caused the emergency stop, or whether anything at all had come loose. In the end, investigators identified two main factors that led to the crash. One of them was Mr. Blaine's decision to use only full service braking, rather than an emergency stop, leaving part of the train's stopping power untouched. No investigation could prove that he ignored or misread the signal. And when he said he had used full brakes, it may have been technically true, if he meant full service braking, not full emergency braking, but that distinction mattered. At the time, Blaine had no idea why the signal had changed to approach. For all he knew, he was simply closing in on a slower-moving train ahead. In that case, hitting the emergency brakes might have been an overreaction, and possibly even dangerous. The second major factor behind the Naperville crash was the dangerous combination of high speed and tight scheduling. The two trains were running just 2 minutes apart, both moving at 81 miles or 130 kilometers per hour, and both on the same track. That narrow gap left no room for error. As this tragedy showed, even the smallest irregularity, a sudden stop, a misjudged brake, or a missed signal, could lead to catastrophe. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad responded quickly. They extended the spacing between express trains from 2 minutes to 15 minutes, giving crews more time and distance to react. Across the country, the crash also had a wider impact. A new nationwide speed limit of 79 miles or 127 kilometers per hour was introduced for passenger trains, down from earlier speeds that reached up to 100 miles or 160 kilometers per hour. During the months that followed, Mr. Blaine, along with several other railroad employees, was formally charged in connection with the crash. But after reviewing the case, a grand jury decided to drop all charges in October of 1946. Their reasoning was clear. No single person bore enough blame to justify a trial. The tragedy had been the result of a chain of decisions and conditions, not one clear act of negligence. And so, in the end, no one was ever put on trial for the Naperville train disaster. The Naperville train disaster was not caused by one failure, but by a series of small decisions, system limitations, and human judgment calls, all made in moments where the margin for error was almost zero. What do you think? Should Mr. Blaine have been held responsible? Did the railroad do enough in the aftermath? Or was this just an accident that no one could have truly prevented? We want to hear your thoughts. Share your views in the comments.